Elias Herschel hated the silence of the deep woods only slightly less than he hated the specific wet crunch of his own boots on the frozen loam. It was the kind of cold that stole the moisture right out of the air and left the darkness smelling metallic, brittle, and infinitely deep. He was 43, and 17 of those years had been spent patrolling the western boundary of the National Forest, a stretch of wilderness so remote it barely registered on tourist maps, a place where the mountains met the sea in a chaos of old-growth timber and punishing ravines. Tonight, the perimeter check was supposed to be routine, a tedious 8-hour sweep designed mostly to deter illegal logging or careless campers who thought boundary marker 47 was merely a suggestion. It was just past 1 in the morning, and the moon was a sliver hidden behind a shroud of thick, fast-moving coastal fog. Elias sat hunched slightly over the steering wheel of his weathered green patrol truck, the engine idling low, the heater struggling to keep the glass from fogging entirely. His high beams cut 2 frail yellow cones into the infinite black ahead. The routine ended abruptly at a small, unexpected disturbance just off the muddy track, a spot where a small drainage pipe overflowed, leaving the ground particularly saturated. He wasn't even looking for it. The lights simply caught a pattern that was jarringly wrong. Elias braked hard enough for the worn suspension to groan in protest. He threw the transmission into park and grabbed his heavy-duty flashlight, the maglite a familiar, comforting weight in his hand. He stepped out, the blast of icy air stealing his breath, pulling his uniform jacket tighter around him. The sound of the idling engine seemed suddenly sacrilegious in the profound stillness. He directed the powerful beam down, scanning the wet, red-brown mud. And there it was, the first immediate hook that snatched the night from boredom into immediate, sickening urgency. It wasn't a deer track, though the area was littered with them. It wasn't the elongated print of a hiking boot or the heavy tread of a logger's gear. It was small, perfectly formed, and utterly impossible. A footprint. The print of a sneaker, perhaps, small enough to fit snugly in the palm of his hand. This was the second hook, reinforcing the first discovery with cold, indisputable fact. Elias knelt, ignoring the mud soaking into the knee of his trousers. The print was shockingly fresh. The edges of the indentation were still sharp, the compression of the earth suggesting it had been laid down only minutes, maybe an hour, before the freezing temperature began to set the mud like concrete. A child, miles, actual miles, from the nearest paved road, much less any structure where a child would logically be housed. The track they were on, a poorly maintained fire road, was considered impassable for standard vehicles due to the washouts and fallen debris. Even experienced hikers avoided this section after dark. There was no conceivable reason for an adult to bring a child here, much less let them wander off at this hour in these conditions. Elias ran the beam of light outward, scanning the immediate periphery, his heart already hammering a frantic, unwelcome rhythm against his ribs. He looked for the corresponding adult prints, the larger, heavier sign that a parent or guardian had been accompanying the child, perhaps carrying them before setting them down briefly. He found nothing, only the distinct, small, isolated prints, marching with an unnerving determination straight off the mud track and into the dense black thicket of Douglas fir and hemlock that marked the boundary of the deepest, most restricted section of the forest. The line of small tracks was precise, almost delicate, but heading directly toward the impenetrable dark. Contextualization flooded his mind. Elias Herschel prided himself on his control and his adherence to protocol. For 17 years, he had been the vigilant caretaker, the eyes and ears of an indifferent wilderness. He knew the difference between an animal drag and a human stumble, between a careless toss of litter and a deliberate abandonment. He radioed Central Dispatch only when absolutely necessary, preferring to handle things himself. Tonight, however, this was already past the scope of a standard patrol check. He reached back into the truck for the handheld radio unit, his fingers fumbling slightly with the cold metal. "Dispatch, this is Ranger Thorne, Code 2, Boundary 47 North, requesting immediate log of situation. I have potentially critical evidence of a missing person, estimated age, small child." The radio crackled back with a sleepy, muffled response from a rookie dispatcher named Sarah, hundreds of miles away in the warm glow of the operations center. "Copy that, Thorne. Repeat information." You found evidence of a missing child at Boundary 47. Sir, that area is— I know what the area is, Sarah, Elias cut in, his voice tight, adrenaline starting to burn in his throat. I have clear, fresh footprints, single set, heading eastbound into the deep woods. No corresponding adult tracks. I am proceeding on foot immediately to follow the trail. Alert County Search and Rescue. Tell them to stage at the 47 staging point, but do not move until I confirm coordinates. Understood, Thorne. Proceed with caution. Maintain communication. Elias knew that proceed with caution was meaningless. Caution had left the building the moment the freezing mud revealed its terrible secret. The problem and conflict escalated instantly. The temperature was dropping. The coastal fog, which had been merely a nuisance, began to thicken into a soupy, insulating blanket. He estimated the child could not survive more than 2 or 3 hours in this exposure, especially if they were lightly dressed. The wind chill, filtered through the moisture, was brutal. Every second he spent talking to dispatch was a second the trail grew colder and the child grew weaker. He quickly secured the truck, leaving the beacon flashing, a frantic, lonely pulse of orange in the black. He retrieved his survival pack, water, emergency blanket, first aid kit, and, crucially, his sidearm, though the latter was mostly for large, territorial animals. He had never needed it for a human threat, and the mere suggestion of needing it tonight was a tremor of deep unease. The open loop was suffocating. Where were the parents? Why had they left a child this deep in the forest? Was this an accident, a strange disappearance, or something infinitely more sinister? The child hadn't stumbled off a campsite. There were no campsites for miles. This was a deliberate path. Elias clicked his maglite to maximum power and began to follow the track into the trees. The development was slow, meticulous, and physically punishing. The light was absorbed almost instantly by the ancient, moss-draped forest. The ground was uneven, a chaotic mess of fallen logs, sharp shale, and dense, wet underbrush. Elias was forced to move slowly, keeping his eyes locked on the faint depressions in the damp earth, moving from one print to the next. The footprints, however, offered a strange, contradictory narrative. They weren't panicked. There was no sign of a desperate run or a terrified stumble. They were steady, small strides, slightly faster than a casual walk, but consistent. It was as if the child knew exactly where they were going, or perhaps they were being led. This observation was the first pattern interrupt. A lost child, especially at night, would be moving erratically, crying, or hunkering down for warmth. This child was marching. After perhaps 50 yards, the beam of his light caught something pale against the black soil. A small sock, white, soaked through with mud, discarded carelessly beside a large, rotting cedar stump. It was not torn. It looked like it had been taken off and dropped. Why would a freezing child intentionally remove their clothing? This defied the basic survival instinct he had learned to expect. He continued deeper, the air growing heavy with the smell of damp earth and decaying leaves. The trees grew tighter, forming an oppressive canopy that swallowed even the ambient light of the sliver moon. Elias was now operating solely within the radius of his flashlight beam, the world outside that small circle. Absolute, terrifying blackness. He checked his wristwatch. It had only been 15 minutes since he found the first print, yet he felt profoundly disconnected, lost not in distance but in time and logic. He reached for his shoulder-mounted radio, pressing the transmit button. Dispatch, Thorne. The track is proceeding into the densest section of the timber. Footwear confirmed, small tennis shoe. I have recovered a single item of clothing. A sock seems intentionally removed. I repeat, no sign of panic or erratic movement from the subject. The progression is steady. I estimate I am roughly 200 meters inside the boundary now. The terrain is getting extremely difficult. Prepare the ground team for a full-scale grid search based on my projected vector. Sarah's voice came back, thin and struggling against the static. Copy that, Thorne. Grid search initiated. Sir, the weather advisory is worsening. Expect heavy rain mixed with snow within the hour. You should... The rest of her transmission was obliterated by a sudden, violent screech of static. Not the familiar hiss of bad reception, but a metallic, angry sound that momentarily deafened him. Elias winced, pulling the unit away from his ear, ready to slam the switch to cut the noise. Then, Out of the electronic maelstrom, a sound emerged, distinct, impossibly clear, and utterly horrifying. This was the re-engagement, the second hook ripping the narrative foundation apart. It was music, not official radio chatter, not a stray transmission from a passing vehicle, but a sound that was synthesized and chillingly soft. A melody, simple and repeating, played with the precise high-pitched tones of an antique music box. It was a lullaby. Rock-a-bye, baby, in the treetop. The frequency was wrong. The sound quality was alien. It shouldn't be possible. This section of the park was a dead zone for everything but the most powerful satellite signals, and certainly not susceptible to terrestrial radio bleed-through, especially not a loop of what sounded like an old children's toy. Elias froze, his muscles locking, the flashlight beam trembling slightly on a mound of wet moss. He stared at the radio unit, convinced he had picked up a foreign object, or that the unit itself was malfunctioning catastrophically. The sound was thin and wavering, fighting the static, but the melody was persistent, the tinkling notes falling into the oppressive silence like drops of poison. "Dispatch, what is that noise?" "Sarah, are you transmitting music?" Elias demanded, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper, trying to overpower the tinny, inescapable tune. The music box played on, entirely ignoring his transmission, entirely independent of the official channel. It sounded close, too close, like it was emanating not from the radio receiver in his hand, but from the air surrounding him, amplified by the radio's frequency. "When the wind blows, the cradle will rock." He rapidly flipped through his manual frequencies, desperately searching for a source. Nothing. The signal was ghosting his main channel, a parasitic transmission that defied explanation. The climax arrived with a double blow. The terror of the music was immediately eclipsed by the terror of the truth on the ground. Elias, tearing his eyes away from the demented radio, refocused on the footprints. He had reached a small flat clearing, perhaps 6 feet wide, where the moss grew thicker and the ground was softer, creating perfect, deeply defined impressions. And here, the determined path of the child came to an abrupt, inexplicable stop. There were 3 final prints, perfectly aligned, heel-toe, ending in the middle of the clearing. They were the clearest prints yet, showing the distinct pattern of the sole, the small arch, the deep indentation of the weight. But after the 3rd print, nothing. No drag marks, no scuffle, no side tracks leading off into the deeper shadow. The trail simply ended. It was as if the child had been walking, taken one last step, and then lifted straight into the air without disturbing a single leaf or branch. The silence of the forest was absolute, save for the demonic mechanical laughter of the lullaby still sputtering from his radio. Elias felt a coldness that transcended the temperature of the night. He swung his beam wildly around the tiny clearing, searching the trees, the ground, the very air. Nothing. The logic of tracking, the system that had governed his entire career, had failed. The child couldn't have vanished. Then, the final, sharp conclusion. The music stopped. The lullaby cut out mid-note, a sudden, absolute termination that left the air heavier, denser than before. The silence that followed was aggressive, pushing against his eardrums. He stood alone in the absolute blackness, the flashlight beam illuminating the tiny, pristine space where a child's journey had been erased. The smell of pine and wet earth was now mixed with a faint, cloying scent he couldn't identify, something sweet, like cheap perfume or stale candy. He dropped the radio unit. It clattered uselessly in the mud. He stared at the final footprint, the indentation a perfect bowl in the moss, the final memorial of a subject that was now gone. The radio had played a lullaby, and the child had disappeared. Elias Herschel was a man of logic and woodcraft, but in that moment, shivering deep within the boundary of the restricted zone, he understood that the search had just changed. This was no longer a rescue operation. This was something else entirely, something ancient and something that was waiting. He re-engaged his focus, his heart now cold and resolved. He had to understand the impossible end of the trail and the impossible music that had marked its close. The wind began to pick up, whining through the upper canopy, bringing with it the first sharp, stinging flecks of sleet. He wiped the freezing moisture from his face, gripping the heavy flashlight tighter. He had come too far to retreat, and the fact that the footprints had been so clear meant the child had left a message, intentional or not. He moved toward the largest cedar adjacent to the clearing, casting his beam high into the chaotic architecture of the branches, ignoring the immediate danger and focusing only on the lingering question. What happens when the cradle falls? He had to move forward. He had to find the truth behind the disappearing steps and the ghost song. The night was vast, and he had only just scratched the surface of the unsettling presence that now stalked the deep forest. This trail was far from over. The mechanical melody, thin and reedy, a mocking approximation of comfort, scraped against the deep silence of the wilderness like iron filings on glass. Elias froze, his breath catching painfully in the frigid air. His initial reaction was a surge of professional paranoia, equipment malfunction, unauthorized frequency bleed, perhaps a civilian hiker using a poorly shielded signal booster too close to the repeater. But the emergency channel, 89, Fair Delta, was notoriously isolated, reserved solely for ranger communications and encrypted distress beacons. Nothing, save for severe solar flares or catastrophic hardware failure, should ever breach that shield, let alone transmit a precise, recognizable, if chillingly distorted tune. He ripped the radio from his chest harness, the plastic housing already slick with condensed moisture and nervous sweat. He stared at the small screen, backlit weakly in green. The frequency displayed was correct. The transmit light was dark. The volume was set mid-range. Yet the music played. A simple four-note phrase repeated endlessly, the cadence slightly too slow, as if stretched taut over a rack. It was a sound designed for peace, yet here, under the watchful, suffocating darkness of the ancient forest, it sounded like a declaration of war waged by ghosts. Elias pressed the mute button. The music stopped instantly. He checked the connection point, the battery housing and the antenna. All secure. He tried to rationalize it, running scenarios through his head, a rogue drone operator testing equipment near the park boundary, although the nearest boundary was 30 miles back, a reflection from a low-orbit satellite catching an old AM signal and relaying it directly into his frequency's blind spot, an astronomical coincidence that defied engineering probability. His gloved thumb nervously flipped the mute switch back. The lullaby immediately resumed. It hadn't been buffering or restarting a loop. It was playing exactly where it had left off, seamlessly integrated into the white noise that usually dominated the channel. The sound wasn't emanating from the speaker directly, at least not entirely. It resonated in the cabin of his ear, vibrating against the bone, suggesting a frequency or modulation tailored to cut through ambient noise and burrow straight into the listener's awareness. Elias felt a desperate need to tear the headset off, but the headset was his only link to safety, and more critically, it was his only source of this profound anomaly. He muted the device again, stuffing it back into the chest harness with unnecessary force. The logical response would be to report the incident immediately, stating a severe communications breach and potential high-level equipment failure. But to report a child's lullaby playing on the emergency frequency while tracking phantom footprints miles off-trail felt like the preamble to mandatory psychiatric evaluation. He had to verify the source, or at least witness the next stage of the phenomenon, before alerting the outside world. The cold was becoming aggressive now, chewing at the exposed skin around his collar and jawline. The temperature was dropping precipitously, far faster than the natural progression of a winter night. This sudden, acute chill brought with it a subtle chemical odor, something acrid, metallic, like wet copper or ozone just before a thunderstorm, though the sky above was a solid, oppressive slab of black velvet, utterly devoid of clouds or stars. Elias lowered his head, focusing once more on the prince. He had wasted nearly 2 minutes wrestling with the radio, and in the deep woods, 2 minutes could mean the difference between catching a scent and losing the trail entirely. The small depressions in the hard earth, half filled with frozen pine needles, continued their relentless linear march. He followed, his powerful headlight beam carving a tunnel through the oppressive blackness, illuminating the path with a harsh, surgical white. The terrain had deteriorated significantly. They were no longer following a gentle slope, but traversing a chaotic field of glacial debris and ancient root systems. The child's prints, however, showed no deviation, no slips, no signs of stumbling over the obstacles that were now forcing Elias to use both hands for balance. It was an unnatural gait, almost a glide, impossible for someone, especially a child, wearing thin footwear in such darkness. He stopped, crouching low, pushing aside a clump of stiff frozen moss to get a better look at the next print. He measured the spacing with his hiking pole. The distance between the steps was widening slightly, transitioning from a determined walk to something bordering on a frantic trot, or perhaps a desperate flight. The child was moving faster, but still maintaining that eerie, inhuman control over the footing. Then he noticed the change in depth. Initially, the footprints had been uniform, pressed down with the weight of a small human body. But here, near the base of an impossibly thick granite outcropping, the indentation seemed shallower. It wasn't the consistency of the soil changing. The print was simply lighter, as if the child's weight was decreasing, or perhaps as if the contact time with the ground was momentary, a series of quick, feather-light taps rather than steps. A wave of dizzying fatigue washed over Elias, making the headlamp beam waver. He felt a sudden, profound disorientation, the kind of psychological pushback that occurs when the mind refuses to accept visual input that defies physics. He reached out, touching the cold, damp earth near the print. The ground was hard, iron-bound by frost. If anything, the steps should be deeper as the child exhausted themselves. He pushed forward, fueled by a rising, acidic panic. The trail of prints veered sharply now, abandoning the relatively flat ground, and beginning an impossible ascent up a steep, slick embankment littered with loose shale. This was the territory Elias had always been warned about, the High Spire's exclusion zone, a labyrinth of crumbling rock formations and hidden sinkholes deemed too volatile even for experienced climbers. They were miles from any navigable path, deep into what the regional maps vaguely labeled unsurveyed high wilderness. And yet the prints went straight up. Elias had to scramble, using the sparse, grasping roots of stunted mountain pines for leverage. He moved with the slow, straining effort of a man fighting gravity and exhaustion, his own massive boot prints scuffing and blurring the fragile trail he was trying to follow. He cursed the unnecessary weight of his gear, the bulk of his jacket, the limitations of his own adult mortal body. The child, conversely, appeared to be floating upward, defying friction. Mid-climb, the radio crackled back to life. It wasn't the lullaby this time, but a rush of pure, undiluted static, a violent, shrieking roar that instantly overpowered the ambient silence. Elias flinched, instinctively turning the volume down, but the intensity didn't lessen. The sound seemed to physically vibrate the air around him. Through the static, a pattern emerged. Not music, not words, but a sound like grinding teeth, or maybe the frantic clicking of some small metallic mechanism being wound too tight. It lasted only a few agonizing seconds before cutting out, replaced once more by the deep, resonant silence that felt heavier and colder than before. Elias paused on a narrow ledge, panting. He tried to contact his station again, punching the transmit button, whispering his call sign into the mouthpiece. Sierra 89er, requesting status check. Over. Silence, not even static. The channel was dead. His emergency communication line, the lifeline linking him to civilization, had been severed, not by distance or terrain, but by whatever had been playing the music and generating that mechanical scream. He gripped the rough bark of a pine, forcing himself to breathe deeply. The fear now was not of danger, but of isolation. He was alone, stranded in a region known for its harshness, following a mystery that had actively disabled his primary means of retreat or rescue. He remembered the old regional folklore, the warnings whispered around campfires, tales dismissed as fever dreams of old prospectors, high on bad moonshine. This area, specifically the High Spires, was locally known as the Nursery of the Forgotten. The legend claimed that decades ago, during the boom and bust cycle of the deep copper mines in the valley below, several children had vanished during a particularly harsh winter. Search parties had only found tiny sets of footprints leading into the spires, always ending abruptly at a cliff face or a massive, unexplained boulder. The official report cited predators or exposure, but the locals insisted the children hadn't died. They had been taken, lured deeper into the wilderness by a sound, a persistent mocking sound that promised warmth and rest. Elias, a man of empirical science and practical training, had always scoffed at such tales. Now, clinging to the side of a frozen cliff face, his radio having just played a ghostly lullaby, he couldn't scoff anymore. He was walking directly into the center of a ghost story. He pressed onward, spurred by the chilling connection to the legend. If he was following a myth, he needed to find the mythological marker. He needed evidence that wasn't just auditory or behavioral. He found it moments later, just before the sheer granite face became completely unclimbable. Tucked into a crevice, beneath a canopy of thick, matted juniper needles, was a patch of color. He reached for it carefully. It was a fragment of thin woolen fabric, frayed and stiffened by years of moisture and freezing temperatures. It was a pale, faded blue, the color of a child's worn winter coat, the kind that had been washed too many times. He held it up to the beam of his headlamp. It felt impossibly old, not recently lost. But beside the scrap of ancient wool, fresh and distinct against the pristine layer of night frost, was a single small boot print. The sight was a brutal psychological blow. The child he was tracking was not a ghost from the past, but the print was directly beside an artifact that seemed centuries old, suggesting a confluence of timelines, a blending of the immediate present and the long-forgotten history of the mountain. Elias forced himself past the immediate shock and followed the prints past the juniper, navigating around a massive monolithic stone that looked like a sentinel guarding the entrance to a darker place. The temperature dropped again, drastically and instantaneously, hitting him like a physical wall of cold air, forcing a plume of white condensation from his lungs. The metallic ozone smell returned, overpowering the scent of pine and wet earth. He emerged onto a tiny plateau-like shelf. The darkness here was absolute, the surrounding trees so dense they swallowed the moonlight entirely. And then he heard it again. It wasn't the radio this time. The radio remained dark and silent in his harness. The sound was spatial, external, resonating from somewhere ahead of him, through the close, heavy air. The lullaby had returned, but its quality was completely transformed. It was louder, clearer, and richer, as if the original tinny music box had been replaced by a full, if slightly melancholic orchestra playing through damp wool. It was mesmerizing, a sound that compelled a cessation of movement, a slowing of breath demanding submission to its rhythm. He fought the urge to stop, forcing his eyes down to the ground, searching desperately for the child's tracks before the music could lull his rational mind into paralysis. He found them. The small, impossibly neat footprints continued across the small shelf, heading towards a gaping maw in the earth, a deep, black fissure in the granite, perhaps an old ventilation shaft or a natural chimney. The prints didn't stop at the edge of the chasm. They went right up to the lip, and they changed one final, terrifying time. The child's small boot prints ended abruptly, replaced by a much larger, deeper impression in the soil. A massive, adult-sized track, almost too large to be human, broad and heavy, as if carrying immense weight. But the most chilling detail was that the new, large tracks were not pointing towards the fissure or away from it. They were simply parallel to the child's last print, traveling horizontally, matching the light, quick stride of the child, side by side, for only 2 steps. Then both sets of tracks vanished, dissolving into the hard, packed earth, leaving only the sound of the pervasive, beautiful, utterly terrifying lullaby echoing from the deep, impenetrable blackness ahead. Elias stared, his mind unable to reconcile the sudden cessation of all tracks with the presence of the colossal, newly appeared footfalls. He felt a chilling certainty that the tracks had not been lost. They had simply lifted from the earth, and the thing that had made them had carried the child deeper into the nursery of the forgotten, perhaps even now waiting, silent and colossal, just beyond the reach of his headlamp beam, singing its soft, deadly song. He had to decide whether to follow the sound into the darkness or turn back now, while the silence of the woods still offered a faint, shivering hope of retreat. Elias felt the cold radiating from the speaker grill of the handheld radio, a temperature that seemed entirely separate from the sharp chill of the mountain air pressing in around him. The sound, when it returned, was not the jarring, static blast he had subconsciously braced for. but a continuation of the same unsettling melody, cleaner now, almost as if the radio had momentarily tuned into a frequency reserved exclusively for the dead or the forgotten. It was the sound of a music box dredged from the bottom of a deep black well, each note perfectly formed, yet coated in an impossible psychic grime. The lullaby, that terrible, looping cadence, had shifted its quality. Where before it sounded ancient, tinny, and distant, now it possessed an unnerving proximity, resonating not just through the small plastic casing, but seeming to vibrate against the very bones of his inner ear. He gripped the radio tighter, his knuckles white against the heavy-duty casing, forcing himself to move. To stop was to surrender to the paralyzing cold fear, a fear far more dangerous than the hypothermia creeping into his ungloved hands. The small beam of his heavy-duty maglite cut a narrow, oscillating swath through the suffocating darkness, illuminating the only anchors he had left in this deteriorating reality, the tiny, heartbreaking impressions in the damp earth. The footprints continued their impossible trajectory, showing no deviation, no hesitation. They followed a line that seemed intentionally designed to bypass any natural ease of travel. They skirted the edge of a sheer drop-off into what the locals called the Widow's Gorge, a 100-foot ravine, only to plunge immediately back into a dense thicket of spruce and rhododendron, so intertwined that Elias had to bodily force his way through, scraping thick, abrasive bark against the heavy canvas of his jacket. The child, whoever or whatever they were, seemed to glide, leaving their delicate marks undisturbed by the surrounding chaos. This disparity, the immense, exhausting effort required of a seasoned man versus the apparent weightlessness of the prince, was tearing the fragile structure of his rational mind apart. He stopped again, not by choice, but because the radio, without warning, had increased its volume threefold. The lullaby now an aggressive assault on the stillness of the night. It was so loud, so sharp, that he instinctively dropped to one knee, covering the speaker with his palm, in a desperate attempt to muffle the sound. He realized the battery indicator light was still glowing steady green, the power robust, yet the volume knob had not been touched. It was a conscious, controlled output change, as if something were manipulating the device to ensure he heard every delicate, terrifying measure. And then, a pattern interrupt. The melody faded, not with static or a snap, but with a deliberate, slow deceleration, like a winding mechanism finally running out of tension. In the momentary silence that followed, a silence that felt heavier and more malevolent than the sound had, Elias heard something else, a drip. He swiveled the powerful flashlight beam, sweeping it across the base of the nearest colossal Douglas fir. The drip repeated. Drip, drip. It wasn't water. It was a viscosity, slow and thick, falling onto the dark, matted bed of pine needles. He knelt, positioning the light carefully. The prints were immediately before him, small, distinct hollows in the soft, dark soil. And nestled right beside the ball of the foot impression, there was a small, nearly imperceptible speck of bright arterial red. It was minuscule, not enough to suggest an injury requiring immediate attention, but enough to rewrite the entire narrative in a flash of chilling clarity. Whatever was making these prints was physical. It was vulnerable. It was bleeding. He traced the next 5 prints, moving slowly, painstakingly. The red speck appeared once more, 2 steps later, then vanished. It wasn't a consistent trail, but a momentary rupture, perhaps a brush against a sharp stone, or the splitting of skin stretched taut by the unnatural cold. This evidence, concrete and horrifyingly organic, intensified his drive but introduced a new layer of dread. If the child was truly bleeding, they were in imminent danger, yet the trail suggested a traveler who was not running in terror but walking with an unnerving, focused purpose. As Elias stood up, brushing the cold, wet earth from his knees, the rhythmic, unsettling pattern of the night resumed its course. The radio hummed back to life, not the full song this time, but just the high, echoing tick-tock sound that precedes the music box mechanism engaging. He focused his attention beyond the beam of the light, trying to pierce the wall of darkness that pressed against him from every side. The woods felt fundamentally wrong now, stripped of the comforting, predictable sounds of nocturnal life. There were no owls, no rustling deer, no insect chorus, only the hollow, consuming silence that swallowed the notes of the cursed lullaby. The topographical map section, which he had checked meticulously before venturing past the known limits of the Black Creek Preserve, told him he should be traversing a gentle slope leading down to the secondary Firebreak stream. Instead, the terrain had become rugged, vertical, and laced with large obsidian chunks of exposed shale that clawed at his boots. He felt as though the geology of the area had fundamentally altered just to challenge his pursuit, the ground itself manifesting opposition. The footprints now began to change their character, escalating the suspense. Previously, they had been merely deep and perfectly formed. Now, the space between each impression began to subtly increase. The child was moving faster, taking strides that should have been physically impossible for such a small frame. It was no longer a walk. It was a measured, focused glide. And in the center of one print, pressed deeply into the muddy substrate, Elias saw something else, the faint striated texture of a woven material, almost like coarse linen or jute. It was not a boot. It confirmed the child was wearing some sort of antiquated soft shoe, or perhaps nothing at all, merely cloth wrapped around the foot, binding it against the cold. He reached down, his gloved fingers tracing the impossible detail of the impression. He felt a sudden, profound spike of adrenaline, a visceral reaction that pushed aside his exhaustion. The mud in this particular print felt colder than the surrounding earth, almost electrically cold, like touching frozen metal. As he pulled his hand back, the radio fully engaged again, drowning out even the sound of his ragged breathing. This time the music was different. It wasn't just the melody of the lullaby. There was a vocal track, faint, ethereal, and devastatingly clear. It was a woman's voice, singing the lyrics in an accent Elias couldn't place, old world perhaps, high and trembling, with a sorrow that transcended time. "Hush now, little one, do not wake. The shadows know the path you take." The sound seemed to emerge from every corner of the forest simultaneously. Elias stumbled back, colliding hard with the rough trunk of a centuries-old cedar. He tore the radio from his belt, intending to smash it against the tree to silence the terrible siren song, but his hands froze an inch from the wood. If he destroyed the radio, he lost his only anchor, his only connection to the outside world, however corrupted that connection had become. More chillingly, the radio felt like an extension of the presence he was pursuing. Destroying it might signal his failure, or worse, draw attention to his location in a way that the music itself had not. He dropped the radio back into its holster, its unsettling music still filling the air. A constant reminder that he was no longer alone, that this was not merely a rescue operation, but a curated, guided experience. The path twisted sharply to the east, abandoning the shale and leading directly into a depression thick with dense, oppressive fog that hugged the ground, barely rising above his waist. The air instantly became thick, saturated and heavy with the smell of wet decay and something subtly metallic, like ozone or old iron. The light beam struggled to penetrate the mist, reflecting back in a shimmering, hazy cloud that blinded more than it illuminated. He forced himself forward, wading into the freezing fog bank. He could barely see his boots, much less the footprints. He dropped to his hands and knees, sweeping the ground beneath the mist with the powerful beam, hunting for the minute details. And there they were. But they had changed again. The prints were no longer distinct heel-to-toe steps. They were now clustered, bunched close together, suggesting the child had stopped, perhaps paused to listen, or look back. And then, abruptly, the bunched prints gave way to something new, a long, shallow drag mark as if the child had suddenly begun crawling, or perhaps, and the thought sent a violent shiver down his spine, had been dragged. Elias scanned the area frantically. The drag mark was intermittent, sometimes disappearing beneath the pine needles, only to reappear in a shallow scoop of the earth, leading inexorably towards a large, oddly shaped geological feature looming dimly in the mist, a massive, solitary boulder, draped in moss and lichen, standing like a forgotten monument. As he approached the boulder, the oppressive humidity of the fog intensified, and the lullaby reached a deafening climax, the woman's voice now joined by a chorus of overlapping, distorted echoes, a cacophony of gentle, sorrowful humming that seemed to warp the very air. He reached the base of the stone monolith. The drag marks ended here, precisely at the edge of the smooth, mossy surface. Elias ran his hand over the damp stone, searching for a crevice, a tunnel, anything. He found nothing, only cold, slick rock. He swung the flashlight beam high, piercing the thickest part of the fog above the boulder, and saw it. It wasn't a natural formation. Perched impossibly atop the 10-foot-high monolith was a small, crudely built structure, a miniature shelter or cairn, built from twisted, bleached pieces of driftwood and covered haphazardly with dark, brittle branches. It was far too small for any adult, clearly designed for a child. As Elias angled his beam, trying to discern the entrance, the radio on his hip emitted a sudden final burst of pure, unadulterated sound. The lullaby ceased completely, replaced by a single, sharp sound, the distinct, unmistakable snap of a small piece of wood breaking under weight. And immediately following the snap, from within the tiny structure high above him, came a sound that froze the blood in his veins, a soft, drawn-out exhalation, followed by the faint, dry rasp of breathing. Shallow, steady, and terrifyingly close, the child was there, and the breathing wasn't panicked. It was the rhythmic breathing of someone who had settled in, someone who was waiting. Elias lifted his head, his neck aching from the strain, his flashlight fixed on the dark outline of the tiny, precarious shelter. He didn't move. He couldn't. He was locked in the beam, held captive by the sound of that single, unnervingly calm breath, realizing with a sick lurch that the footsteps hadn't just led him somewhere. They had led him to a confrontation he was profoundly unprepared for, at a time and place chosen not by chance but by design. He felt the terrifying certainty that he was not the hunter, but the intended audience for a performance that was only now beginning its most critical and most deadly act. The heavy silence that had followed the radio's final burst was not emptiness, but the charged, expectant quiet preceding a cataclysm. He slowly reached for the heavy-duty service knife sheathed on his belt, his eyes glued to the dark opening in the structure above, waiting for the shadows to finally yield their occupant. The air grew colder still, heavy with the weight of that unseen presence, demanding that he ascend the impossible stone to face what lay within. The frigid air, previously a manageable adversary, now descended upon Elias like a physical weight, crushing the warmth from his lungs. He had reached the terminal point of the impossible trail. The child's footprints, those maddeningly small impressions that had led him miles through the indifferent wilderness, ended abruptly at the base of an ancient, petrified redwood, a giant scarred by millennia of storms and silence. There was no cave, no dilapidated lean-to, and crucially there was no sign of a child, living or otherwise. The ground immediately surrounding the redwood was strangely devoid of undergrowth, a circle of exposed black earth that seemed to absorb the meager light of his headlamp. It was here, exactly where the final perfect footprint lay pressed into the damp soil, that the lullaby reached its absolute crystalline peak. The radio, still gripped loosely in his numb hand, was screaming the gentle tune. It was no longer distorted static mixed with music. It was pure, isolated, high-fidelity sound, vibrating through the metal casing and into the bones of his wrist. "Hush now, darling, the moon is low, the shadows stretch and yearn to grow." The voice, infantile yet possessing a profound, mournful quality, seemed to emanate not just from the speaker, but from the very air molecules oscillating in the immediate vicinity. Elias felt a wave of dizzying nausea. He lowered the radio slowly, cautiously, observing the space around the base of the tree. The footprints ceased, but the evidence of the source did not. His light played across the root structure of the colossal redwood. It was gnarled and thick, forming natural crevices, and there, tucked into a shielded hollow, not a child, but the remnant of a life. A tiny, hand-carved wooden rocking chair, perhaps meant for a doll but sized perfectly for the infant foot that had guided him. The wood was dark, almost black, slick with damp rot, yet recognizable as a piece of lovingly crafted furniture. Next to the chair, almost swallowed by the invasive moss, lay a small, tarnished silver rattle. Elias froze, his heart hammering against the wall of his chest with the frantic speed of a bird trapped in a snare. The cold no longer mattered. The physical exhaustion of the forced march was irrelevant. The terror was pure, metaphysical. The footprints he had followed were not fresh. They were impressions of something residual, something echoing, something playing out a final tragic journey, long after the physical form had succumbed to the wild. He raised his lamp higher, sweeping the beam methodically over the root system, hunting for logical explanation. A shed grave, a hidden marker, anything to root this anomaly in human tragedy and not cosmic horror. And then he saw it. Carved into the rough bark of the redwood, meticulously shallow, aged by decades of weather, was a single inscription. It was written in a formal 19th century script. Elara, taken by the deep cold. Winter 1898. Sleep now, little ghost. The world tilted. The narrative that Elias had meticulously constructed over the last 4 hours, a lost child, a frantic search, a rescue mission, shattered into 1,000 pieces of grim realization. He was not pursuing the living. He was being led by the memory of the dead, orchestrated by the residual energy of a sorrow so immense it had imprinted itself upon the landscape. The lullaby intensified again, peaking in a high, sustained note that bordered on agonizing static, before gently dissolving back into the melancholic melody. This was the true climax. The radio wasn't playing a recorded loop. It was tuning into the frequency of the haunting itself. The radio waves, freed from the mundane communications of the park system, had locked onto the ethereal broadcasting signal generated by this specific site of tragedy. Elias instinctively reached for his sidearm, not because he anticipated a threat he could shoot, but because the cold, hard steel offered a fleeting, tangible connection to reality. He stood in the presence of a sorrowful truth, confirmed not by historical records, but by phantom sound and spectral tracks. He spent what felt like an eternity, though it was likely only minutes, staring at the cradle, the rattle, and the inscription. He tried to rationalize. Perhaps the footprints were caused by a small, rare animal known to mimic human tracks, and the radio interference was merely atmospheric. But the confluence, the small shoes, the lullaby, the inscription, was too precise, too cruel to be coincidence. He felt the inexplicable urge to touch the rocking chair, to offer some semblance of comfort to the century-old tragedy. As his glove brushed the rotting wood, the lullaby abruptly stopped. Silence. Not the normal ambient silence of the deep forest, but a vacuum, a complete cessation of all sound, save for the frantic, wet gasping of his own breath. His ears rang painfully in the sudden absence of the music. The silence was heavier, more intimidating than the unsettling music had ever been. He knew he was being watched, observed by the invisible, ancient sorrow that had drawn him here. The loop was closed. He had acknowledged the memory. He had confirmed the tragedy. Now, he needed to leave. Elias forced himself to turn, his movements sluggish and mechanical, like a diver ascending too quickly from crushing depths. He had to record the coordinates, establish a physical record of the site before the morning sun or the next rainfall erased the impossible evidence. He fumbled with the GPS unit mounted on his packstrap, his fingers thick and unresponsive. As he finally locked in the coordinates, 39.7844N, 120.9812W, a spot unmarked on any park map, deep within the oldest, most treacherous section of the reserve, the radio crackled back to life. But it wasn't the lullaby. It was the frantic voice of dispatcher Miller, distorted and panicked, breaking through the white noise. "Ranger Elias, respond. We've been trying to reach you for over 3 hours. Where are you? Your transponder went dead. We have a search party preparing for deployment. What is your status, Ranger?" The shock of Miller's voice, loud, human, demanding, and tethered to the bureaucratic reality he had abandoned, was almost as jarring as the spectral music had been. "Miller," Elias croaked, his voice strained and weak. "This is Elias. I confirm my position. I am off-grid. I followed the prints. I found the endpoint." "The child, Elias? Did you find the missing child?" Miller's voice was tight with anticipation. Elias hesitated, his eyes sweeping back to the root hollow, to the cradle meant for Elara, sleeping since 1898. "How do you report a tragedy that happened a century ago?" guided by footprints that belonged to an echo and sound that originated from grief. "Negative, Miller," he finally reported, choosing his words with surgical precision. "No signs of a lost person. I repeat, no signs of a recent lost person. The tracks terminated at an unregistered historical marker. Stand down the search party. I'm returning to the patrol road. I'll file the full report upon return. Over." He didn't wait for a response, slamming the mic button down. He knew the brevity and vagueness of his answer would spark immediate suspicion and follow-up questioning. But he needed the physical distance from that specific radius of sorrow before he could attempt to articulate the horror. He began his trek back. The journey that had felt so determined and purposeful hours earlier now felt like a desperate, heavy retreat. He moved faster than before, spurred by the consuming desire to reach the boundary where logic ruled and where the trees did not whisper secrets of the dead. The return journey was a blur of exhausting focus. Elias refused to look down at the trail he was retracing, convinced that if he saw the faint receding impressions of the child's feet, they would turn and lead him back into the heart of the darkness. He emerged from the dense undergrowth and onto the gravel maintenance road just as the first weak bruised light of pre-dawn began to stain the eastern horizon. The sight of his patrol vehicle, solid and reassuring, felt like a rescue raft on a turbulent sea. Miller was waiting at the ranger station, clipboard in hand, face etched with worry and professional annoyance. "Elias, what the hell happened? Your GPS locator was offline. And what was that cryptic report about a historical marker?" Elias stepped past him, peeling off his sweat-soaked parka, the cold finally hitting him fully. He walked straight to the station's geological survey maps, his mind still operating under the shadow of the redwood. "Miller, pull the county archives, specifically late 19th century homestead records in the Upper Canyon Ridge area. Focus on missing persons reports from the severe winter of 98 to 99. Miller, sensing the gravity in Elias's voice and the haunted look in his eyes, silently complied, tapping on the historical database. As the computer whirred, Elias placed his radio carefully on the wooden desk. He felt a profound aversion to touching it again. It was the instrument that had betrayed him, the object that had transformed from a tool of safety into a conductor of the impossible. Miller pointed at the screen. "Got a hit. December 1898. Homesteaders named Rourke filed a report regarding the disappearance of their infant daughter, Ilara Rourke. Apparently the parents fled the area a few months later, cause of death listed as exposure, though no body was ever recovered." The name slammed into Elias. Ilara, the same name carved into the redwood. He leaned against the desk, running a trembling hand over his face, scrubbing away the exhaustion and the lingering chill of the deep cold. "The location, Miller. Does it match the coordinates I gave you?" Miller cross-referenced the coordinates with the original Rourke claim survey. He looked up, his face pale. "They overlap, Elias. Exactly. That area has been designated as unnavigable forest since 1930. Nobody goes there." "They do now," Elias whispered, the payoff sinking in like lead. "Someone went there 100 years ago and something brought me there tonight." The silence in the station was thick, loaded with unspoken questions. Miller, despite the archival proof, still searched for a logical gap. "But the footprints, Elias. You said they were recent enough to follow. How could a baby that died in 1898 leave clear footprints tonight?" Elias didn't answer immediately. He looked at the radio, then back at the map, visualizing the trail, the rhythmic pace of the tiny steps, the unsettling clarity in the freezing mud. They weren't footprints, Miller. They were the path of the song, the residual motion of the final minutes of a panicked search, replayed only when the frequency was right. He picked up a heavy, leather-bound volume, the historical ledger of the park system, kept for unusual events not fit for official reports. He grabbed a pen and began to write, detailing every horrific step of the night. The strange, small tracks, the sudden shift in the radio frequency, the hypnotic lure of the antique lullaby, the physical termination point, and the discovery of the inscription and the cradle. He wrote meticulously, ensuring every detail was dense, exhausted, and verifiable against the historical record, determined not to let this incident be dismissed as fatigue or hallucination. When he finished the report, he pushed it across the desk to Miller, who glanced nervously at the final paragraph. The evidence suggests a cyclical haunting phenomenon amplified by radio wave interception, specifically tuned to the 4.7 frequency band. Elias then approached the radio again. He lifted the antenna, fiddled with the squelch, and reset the frequency to the standard park channel. But before he locked it down, he paused. Just for a moment, he let his finger hover over the 4.7 band. He could feel the memory of the music, the sorrowful, slow, hypnotic rhythm of Ilara's song, waiting to be accessed. He abruptly slapped the radio back to channel 1, locking the knob firmly in place. He had done his duty. He had followed the tracks to their heartbreaking conclusion and recorded the truth of the woods, a truth that existed outside the boundaries of their regulations and protocols. He looked at Miller, whose expression had transitioned from professional skepticism to reluctant, chilled belief. "We mark that area as off-limits, Miller, permanently, and we do not discuss how I found that inscription or what was playing on my radio. This report stays here, in the cold file." Elias turned, ready to walk away and seek the first true rest he'd had in 48 hours, though he knew the sound of the antique lullaby would now be permanently etched into the quiet moments of his life. But then, the radio on the desk, the one he had just locked down to channel 1, began to faintly emit a sound. Not the lullaby, but a high, thin, almost imperceptible whistle, a sound Elias knew well. It was the sound of air escaping, a quiet, drawn-out exhalation. He and Miller stared at the device, horrified. The park ranger who followed a child's footprints at night, drawn by a lullaby broadcast by the dead, realized in that final, terrifying second that the spectral broadcast wasn't entirely over. The child's ghost had acknowledged him, had led him to its resting place, and in doing so, had left a piece of its century-old grief clinging to the very instrument that had amplified its sorrow. The whistle continued for a long, slow moment until it resolved itself into 2 distinct, clear syllables, whispered directly through the speaker, seemingly without the aid of any discernible radio wave or static, merely sound coalescing in the room. "Thank you." The ranger stumbled back, hitting the wall. The incident was closed, the tragedy confirmed, but the haunting was far from finished. Elias knew then that he was inextricably linked to the place, the child, and the song. Every time the radio crackled with static, every time the night air grew too cold, he would hear the faint, residual echo of Ilara's slumber song, a chilling reminder that the park, in its beautiful, indifferent vastness, was far older and far more populated than any living person dared to imagine. If you have ever felt a profound, inexplicable chill deep in the wild, or heard a sound that defied the physics of your world, consider the possibility that you, too, might have momentarily tuned into a frequency reserved for the lost, and remember that sometimes the deepest, darkest quiet of the woods is only the silence between the verses of a very old song.